Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Foreign Affairs Live. We have a spectacular discussion for you tonight. We have assembled four of the world's top experts on American foreign policy, going from left to right, Walter Russell Mead, Jessica Stern, Bret Stephens, and Tom Christensen. Each are distinguished authors, scholars, practitioners often, who are really a fantastically diverse but intellectually strong group of people to discuss Obama's foreign policy with us. Three of them, Tom and Bret and Jessica, have pieces in our September-October issue talking about U.S.-China policy, U.S. policy in the war on terror, and why my article on praising Obama's foreign policy is entirely wrong. Walter has been in the pages lots of times. They all have books either just out or about to be out. Tom has a wonderful book on U.S.-China relations that it should be a must-read in all your classes. Bret has a wonderful book out on American retreat and the dangers of isolationism. Jessica has a wonderful book out on ISIS, and Walter is writing yet another book. He's writing one on Israel that'll be a must-read when it does come out. So before we get into the discussion of foreign policy, I wanted to sort of take this opportunity to show you guys sort of the diverse ways you get to become a macher. So I wanted to have each of them just say a little bit about how they got to the positions they are in today, what their career path has been like, and what sort of general advice they'd give young people thinking about grad school at all. So Walter, why don't we start with you?
Well, Gideon hates my advice. Basically, my advice is run away and join the circus. That I didn't go to grad school. In some ways, I'm sure I would be a smarter, better person if I had, but I didn't, and I seem to be stumbling along all right. I wrote, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I was increasingly interested in international affairs. I read a lot of history as a kid and as a young person, started trying to pull my thoughts together into some kind of order. Met a literary agent at a cocktail party here in New York. After we got to know each other, she said she'd take a look at my manuscript. Then she said, well, how much money do you have saved up? And at that time I was working as a temp typist in a, for an office firm. And I said, I got about 6 months of living money saved up. She said, I can sell this book in 6 months. So on Bastille Day, in 1985, I quit my my last actual job, and since then I've been writing, publishing, working at various think tanks.
Was that Mortal Splendor?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I didn't know that was the origin of Mortal Splendor. A great book that is still worth reading about American foreign policy.
Thank you. And so that was back in, she sold that in 85 or 86. And so since then I've been able to do pretty well. Not having a PhD was a liability for a while, but after a while it kind of turns into a bit of an asset. So at least think about the fact that if you go to grad school, you'll be, I have grad school and the tenure system to me are a little bit like the deal that poor Jacob had in the Bible, where he had to work for 7 years to marry the woman he didn't love. And then another 7 years work, after which he got the one he wanted the whole time. And I'd say cut to the chase. Find the one you really want and marry her, or him, or whatever. But anyway, that's my advice, and you can be completely free to disregard it. Sure that Gideon will think you're doing the right thing.
No, I reserve the right to kibitz on everybody. What I will say is Walter's path has been a spectacular one, and if my book sold 1/10 of what his books do, I would be very happy. What I would say is, if you're going to take the path that Walter suggested and the path that he himself has followed, you need to be, A, very smart, as Walter is. You need to be incredibly good and self-disciplined at actually being productive. Because if you're not in an environment with people doing things regularly and churning out stuff, if you're reliant on your own resources, you need to actually drive yourself. Walter does, incredibly hard worker. And you need to bring something special to the table. Walter has an extraordinary writing style and an incredibly capacious mind. He's basically a public intellectual of the old school, non-academic type. And it can be done. And in fact, he's living proof that it can be done. But you need to have some way to in effect, supplant the lack of your standard academic credentials. Jessica, what's your take? on your course here?
I had always wanted to be a writer, but I did really badly in a writing class as an undergrad, and I ended up majoring in chemistry, which came easily to me. And then when I went to grad school, I actually planned on getting a PhD in chemistry. I heard about this program at MIT that combined policy and usually engineering, and I fell into it. Eventually, I heard one lecture on terrorism. I started working on the possibility that terrorists could use chemical weapons. But that was sort of the beginning of this very odd career choice, or what seemed extremely odd in the mid-1980s, and in fact seemed odd until 9/11. And my dissertation advisor actually admitted to me that he really thought, he's now Secretary of Defense, he thought it was a very strange choice for me to work on this bizarre topic. And I got my doctorate, in fact, in public policy, not really knowing the difference between public policy and political science, coming from a technical background. That was, I would say, a mistake in terms of an academic career, but it's worked out fine even so. I wouldn't recommend getting a doctorate in public policy or in law if you're really interested in being an academic in a political science department. It wasn't really a great idea, but it has worked out fine.
It's easier to move from the government department to the K school than the K school to the gov department?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Jessica is a landmark case in studying, actually Tom will also be the same kind of thing, studying something that you care about even when it's not fashionable, becoming literally one of the world's major experts on it, and then having the subject turn fashionable on you and reaping the rewards when everybody else, the lemmings, come in trying to chase the subject. You're already there as a real expert, which is really, really interesting. I should also say that Jessica is the only one of us who actually has been portrayed by Nicole Kidman in a movie, which is a rare kind of thing. Her time at the NSC was significant enough for books to have been written about it and turned into movies. So, Bret Stephens.
Well, I grew up as an American in Mexico City, so I was always interested in the wider world, and it also made me see, I think, the United States in a slightly different light than most Americans typically see it. Went to the University of Chicago, which was a wonderful education. It was wonderful education mainly because I really worked, I spent my time with classics of political thought, and I feel that that education from Aristotle through Hobbes through the moderns is the most valuable thing I've ever learned, and it stays with me today. I did go to graduate school for a master's, and I'm probably not supposed to say this to graduate students. I thought it was the biggest waste of time ever, and a big waste of money because I paid my own tuition, so it was doubly bad, and it hasn't served me at all. But that's, as I said, my experience. A couple of points. I was always interested in journalism. I was always the most opinionated person in my family, which is saying something, and in my schools. And so opinion journalism, in a sense, came quite naturally. And I was lucky when I was young to get a job at the Wall Street Journal. I left for a sort of a 3-year sabbatical. I was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. But I really I found my home at the Wall Street Journal. I guess I'd say, I was aided by a lot of luck, and there's no planning for luck, just being the kind of guy that gets asked, or happens to be there and available, and that's just pure serendipity. But looking back, I would say 2 things. I think your 20s are the most important years of your life. It's in your 20s that you're either going to lay foundations for everything that comes, or you're just going to drift and fall into something. And so it's good early on to use these years, if you're still in your 20s, use them wisely. Two secondary points. I think if I had success at the Journal, it's because I worked harder than all of my peers at the time. I worked really hard. And you know how you know it? When you're in the office at 1 o'clock in the morning and nobody else is. And if you do that enough, you'll realize you're actually working harder than every, you're putting in the hours that are genuinely required to be successful. I think the second point is
Wait, is it important to work that hard so that you get recognized by others for working hard, or because your product is better?
Because your product is better, and hopefully recognition will follow. Okay. Look, everyone, it's not because I'm smarter. I don't think I'm dumber, but there are a lot of intelligent people, but there are a lot of intelligent people who feel they can coast and they can do good enough work. And there are people who are going to go a little further, and eventually that will be noticed. I think the second thing is I always had a vague, kind of dreamy idea of what I wanted to be. At least when I was younger, this is no longer the case, but I was a great daydreamer, right? And when I hire our annual crop of summer interns at the editorial page, and I sometimes say, who are you in 50 years' time? And they'll say things like, well, I see myself in the kind of social, political space, and this kind of this blah. And the people that I end up hiring are like, frankly, I'd really like to be the Secretary of State. Like, okay, that's an ambition, that's a dream. And if you have some crazy dream like that, even if you won't admit it to your employer, but just to yourself, it's a little light at the end of the tunnel. It's a kind of a sense of how you're going to find your way and where you ought to belong and where your passions and your talents coincide. And I think that's a very useful thing to have in life. Don't quash your dreams when you're 20 years old. Ring fence them and nurture them, even if it's in that quiet minute or two before you drift off to sleep. I think that's more valuable than you might realize right now.
Tom Christensen.
Oh, thanks. I fell in love with college as an institution. The first generation of my family to go to college. My father was a Depression kid who fought in Europe in World War II, and by the time the war was over, he had a kid, so he couldn't go to college. But he read all the time, and he encouraged us to go to college. And he did something else that was really important, which is he told us to study what we were interested in. He didn't tell us to go into any specific field, and that served me really well. I've always worked on things that I'm interested in, and I think that makes you better at what you do. It makes you more productive, more willing to put in long hours because you're doing what you want to do, not what other people want you to do. So I'd encourage you to do that in your careers. And I stumbled across China by dumb luck. I was a history major at Haverford College. We had distribution requirements, which students usually dread, but it turned out to be a blessing for me. So my senior year, I needed a third area of the world in which I had some degree of expertise. We had a visiting professor from Korea who taught Chinese history and Chinese philosophy, the history of Chinese thought. I got interested
in Ho Lee?
In Ho Lee, who became the first South Korean ambassador to Russia and the first woman ambassador from South Korea once democracy blossomed in South Korea. So she changed my life. I stay in touch with her. At the time, I read and spoke Spanish. I don't anymore. I can still read it, but I can't speak it. And at the time, Latin America was a hot topic in international relations because of the Contras and the Sandinistas. And I really wasn't interested in Latin America at all. So I worked in the construction industry in New York after I graduated. And I went to night school for Mandarin because I realized if I was going to get interested in China, I had to learn the language. So I did that, and then I got into a master's program. And after being rejected at every PhD program, I did well enough in the master's program to get on scholarship, which I needed to do because I didn't have money after the first year. And then I got into a PhD program on scholarship. And every year,
master's did you do?
I got a master's at the University of Pennsylvania in international relations. And I am the last person.
That's right, you were Ariel Cohen's
the last person to receive that degree. I think they decided after they gave it to me, they were shutting down the program. That was just too embarrassing. And I went on to Columbia to get a PhD. I met
we were pre-docs
Gideon
together.
At pre-docs.
He was Fareed Zakaria's office mate. That's why I
Yeah.
used to hang out with Fareed. So I met
So, the two things I take away from it is I think college is a really important institution. It was transformational for me, and I wanted to be a college professor. So I really bristle when my colleagues say, oh, I really love this new academic job I got. I never have to teach. I don't understand why people go into teaching if they don't want to teach. I like to teach undergrads. I like being in a place like Princeton that emphasizes undergraduate education. And I think it's a noble profession. You do need a PhD really to excel in the profession of academic teaching. But if you're going to get a PhD, don't take the topics that seem hot at the time. I studied Chinese foreign policy in the middle 80s when it was not the hot topic. Everyone who did China was studying rural reforms or business reforms. And China became a great power. And I would still be doing what I'm doing. Maybe I wouldn't be getting so many invitations from people like Gideon if China weren't a great power. But I'd be happy getting out of bed in the morning, and I'd be happy putting in long hours. And I tell my students, I'm not successful. Don't look at me as a success in any but one way. And that is that if someone gave me $1 billion tomorrow, I'd be at my office at the same time the next day. And if you can say that, then you've been successful.
God, that's so moving. The thing about Tom is that he comes up with this kind of stuff, and it's actually not just canned or patter. It's just actually honest and genuine, which is one of the reasons why we love him. So Tom and Jessica, you two have served in government, as well as written about it and written about the substance. To my knowledge, Bret and Walter, you guys haven't. Does being in government, first of all, do you have to do something to get in government that you would not, if you that you need to think about doing early? And does being in government give you a perspective that non-governmental types don't have?
I think it gives you, you cannot imagine what it's actually like unless you're there. It's the idea that personalities don't matter, that there are rational actors. I mean, that goes out the window immediately as soon as you are in government. I think it's very, very hard to understand from the outside. I'm very reluctant often to comment on current policies because I know there's just so much I don't know, or why such policies are made, because it's been some time since I've been in government. I highly recommend it to all of you who are interested in international affairs, and one of the ways to get there is to apply for an international affairs fellowship from the council. That's how I went into government, and you had an
I did not. I applied twice and didn't get it either time.
But you...
They have standards.
But I showed up anyway, and they didn't quite kick me out.
But you had an Olin to go to government, or...
Yeah, I created it after
Okay,
that.
okay.
I had
So
the job, but I didn't get the fellowship, so then I created one via Harvard
Okay.
to go do it.
Anyway, I create your own if you have to. There is policy management intern. I mean, they're all
OPM?
There are all kinds of fellowships that enable students to get into government for a while. I highly recommend it.
You went in late in your career rather than early, or later.
Yeah, I went in because I was asked, and I was kind of raised to do public service when asked. So I was surprised. I've been an independent my whole career on principle, and I think too many professors are partisan. And I was asked by the Bush administration, by the White House, to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. It's the greatest thing that happened to me. I got to work with really, really talented, skilled Foreign Service officers who taught me a lot about the world. I learned about the policy process. I got to serve, which I wanted to do. But if you ask me, do I have a strategy? I think my strategy is probably not the most effective. I think you're supposed to sign up for campaigns, and you're supposed to cut the crusts off sandwiches for people and hand them to them. And I've never done those things. So I don't know if I'll ever be asked again. But if I were asked again, I would serve again. So that's my story.
Did it change how you looked at your field, being on the inside?
Oh, sure, yeah. I learned a lot, both philosophically and substantively, while I was working in the State Department. And the one thing that I knew before, but I emphasize now more in my teaching, is that policy choices are often between bad, worse, and catastrophically terrible. And the difference between bad and catastrophically terrible is huge and consequential. And if you can hit that sweet spot of grasping onto that bad policy, you will be criticized robustly by the media, by your academic colleagues when you go back to, but you will know that you did a lot of good, because there aren't a lot of silver bullets out there.
I think that's 100% correct. When I teach foreign policy, I always start off with Rose's first law of foreign policy, which is that all policies suck, but some suck more than others.
And the difference is huge. And the difference is because if you're going to work in the United States government, you're working for a great power that has global reach. That when you screw up, it affects not just lots of Americans, it affects a lot of people around the world.
Last prequel. Walter and Bret, you guys not only are active writers, but incredibly graceful writers. How did you get to be good writers? By the way, people don't think enough or talk enough about the sheer ability to write and the important role it plays in your career. It helps you think clearly, it helps you communicate clearly, and it helps other people understand what you're saying. And it's something you can affect. You can make yourself a better writer by practice. And I'm curious how Walter and Bret became good writers.
Well, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you that if you have two people of equal talent and equal knowledge, the one who is the better writer is going to have the brighter career. And that may be true even more in the future than it used to be, because magazines like Foreign Affairs used to be able to spend a lot more time turning indecipherable prose by academics into prose that a more general audience could read. But with the internet and the sort of changes in cost, it's getting a lot harder for places to do that. So that I think in your generation, the person with a fluent writing style, fluent and compelling writing style, and I may say even a little entertaining, is probably going to, it's going to be a bigger factor in your career than ever. How do you get that way? Well, one thing is you can't spend too much time reading government reports and foundation policy things. You have to, if you're going to write good things, you have to read well-written pieces. You have to, develop an ear for English. Most people, frankly, write English as if it were their second or even their third language. And some people are very good. Joseph Conrad, English was his second language. He was terrific. Third, okay. What was his first?
Polish. What was the second?
French.
French, okay. Well, that was cheating. French helps. But anyway, you need to read good stuff. When you find a paragraph that is just really striking, imitate it. Try to figure out, how did this person do that? If you really want to get good, I would suggest you devote some time to trying to write in poetic forms, because they make you aware of the sound of words, of the import of choosing words, the right word, the wrong word, of rhythm. Even in prose, rhythm is incredibly important in carrying conviction, carrying, those of us who write about sort of abstract things, ideas, you have a problem, because most people think in terms of stories and they remember in narrative stories. A lot of what you need to do to be effective in this field is to be able to give a sense of narrative development to an intellectual discourse, so that it reads and feels a little bit more like a story. A simple thing like a rhythm that carries people through from the beginning of the sentence to the middle of the sentence to the end of the sentence with a sense of accomplishment and direction will actually open their minds to the substance of what you're doing. So you cannot, particularly early in your career, you cannot spend too much time trying to develop an effective writing style.
I will just confirm that by saying that at Foreign Affairs, because I believe exactly with Walter, what he just said, you can't be a good editor without being a good writer and having a good ear as well. To know when a sentence clunks and when it has to be changed, you need to have a good ear. It's not just a good mind. Mm-hmm. And so we have an internal library that I've picked to give people style guides to, in effect, mentally, not Strunk White type things, but Shakespeare and Grant's memoirs and Michael Oakeshott and Evelyn Waugh and everything from Dr. Seuss to Suzanne Collins to Dashiell Hammett to whatever, because a good writing style that is pacey and euphonious and clear and strong and vigorous, it can be applied in any kind of form, and you want those principles that can then inform your own writing.
That's right.
You have the last comment on writing.
You really said it for me. One last piece of advice going back to the previous question is that all of you should read Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. If you're in your 20s, just stop whatever crap you're reading now, go read that book immediately, because it'll change your life, and it's a great book. You spoke about, I deal with young writers all the time, especially our interns, and you sort of see the quality of their writing. And sometimes I try to take our interns aside and say, well, this is why this paragraph works, and this is why it doesn't. And I've learned by experience that writing cannot be taught. Writing can only be learned. And there's an important distinction. I could tell you why something works, why Walter's prose works and Gideon's doesn't. Sorry. That was just a joke at his expense. But you could discover this fact for yourselves. And that only comes from reading great writing and saying to yourself, why does that work? Why does that work? When I started out as a journalist and I would have my pieces edited, I would take my original and I'd take the edited piece and I'd say, well, why did he make these changes? And I wouldn't simply assume that my editor had kind of randomly decided to reorder words in some godlike fashion that I could never understand. These were choices that were being made not just on the level of ideas, but in the manner of sentences. Walter also spoke about poetry, and I think that I was well served by a father who insisted that I memorize poems. And I memorized a lot of poems. And so when you have a poem like, Gerard Manley Hopkins, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. You understand that words are not just written and read, they're spoken and heard. And you should write in a way that has conviction and resonance when it is spoken and heard. And I don't think people get that it matters how long your paragraphs are. It matters how long those sentences are. It matters, I have to tell you something. I spend more time thinking about my semicolons than the point of my article.
It shows.
Which Gideon, I knew you were going to say. I knew.
Right. Gideon staged this whole event, so he would say just that.
But it really matters. The structure of your sentences are what is going to make a person stop and say, it's going to give your reader the feeling, I'm going to keep reading what this person is writing. That matters.
This is all fantastic advice, but we also have to get to some substance, even though, by the way, it should say something to you that these foreign policy hakamim, these big shots, authors and experts, get so passionate about their career choices, about their writing choices, not just about the subject matter. That's the sign, as Tom said, that these are the people you should be talking to, not, although to be fair, Andy Moravcik's now writing a book on opera because he's always been more interested in opera than in political science. Yeah, exactly.
He can do that. I'm from Long Island. English is not my mother tongue.
Jessica. The Obama administration's policies in the war on terror. A number of people who voted for Barack Obama felt that they were voting for him because he had voted against the war in Iraq, or would have voted against the war in Iraq if he had been able to, and because he was opposed to much of the Bush administration's policies in the war on terror. They then felt very disappointed, at least in the war on terror aspect, by the feeling that he has not lived up to his campaign promises. Bret's going to say why it's bad that he lived up to them in Iraq. But what is your take on the Obama administration's war on terror?
Well, I think the most obvious thing to say at the outset is that it isn't really that different from the previous administration. He tried very hard to make significant changes, and the place where he made the most significant change, I understand you will be the one to address that, I think was his biggest mistake well, I'll let you go on there, but in regard to surveillance, in regard to the use of drones, he used significantly more drones than the previous administration. There's much the same. He promised to close Guantanamo. That turned out not to be possible. There are many things he wanted to do when he actually was in office. He was faced with the terrible catastrophic policy versus the bad policy. And in some cases, luckily, he chose the bad, not in all.
What would you think? Okay, so there are some people who feel like newborn presidents. They come into office and they have these crazy ideas that they took in from the outside, and then the inside staffers often think, look, we're going to educate you and teach you how to behave, and you'll come to realize why the policy exists. I think every single president has pledged to change China policy over the last 25 or 30 years, and they all end up with the same damn China policy, and there's a good reason for that, because it's a fairly sensible one. But on the war on terror, is it a good thing that he didn't change things much, or a bad thing?
I think there's always the wish for addressing terrorism in the long term and the short-term remedy. And the short-term remedy often makes things worse in the long term. But when the president is there, his number one goal is to protect the American people today. And so he or she is forced to address that immediate threat, even though it may make things worse in the long run. I think It's just the nature of counterterrorism.
What's an example of one thing that is something that is costly in the short term but ultimately necessary for positive things in the long term? So the kind of thing that an expert like you would recommend but that the president always rejects because it's too costly in the short term?
Well, there is, we know there are some, just in regard to terrorism, there are some risk factors that are pretty clear. One is when there is a youth bulge. How do you get a youth bulge? It turns out when you educate women, they have fewer kids. So the president has been talking about not just education, improving education around the world, especially in the developing world, and focusing in particular on Africa. He's talking about it, but it isn't a major part of our foreign policy because there are other more urgent ways to address the immediate threat. Is that?
Okay. Bret, so you think the Obama administration has retreated unnecessarily, and presumably Iraq, and with a lot of bad things happening as a result, Iraq would presumably be a prime example of that, correct?
Right.
So explain what why is Iraq followed by ISIS a perfect parable for the Obama administration's foreign policy in general?
Well, I mean, the essential point is that when you create power vacuums, because you're eager to right-size your foreign policy and focus on the liberal core as opposed to the unstable periphery, for example, you wind up creating spaces in which groups like ISIS can thrive. I mean, Iraq has to be treated in the same context as essentially as part of the Syria crisis. And I think, in my view, there's no view that Obama's two mistakes on Syria. Number one, threats made that weren't delivered on, or red lines drawn that were crossed and then ignored, eroded American credibility and emboldened emboldened our adversaries. But we also simply created zones of chaos where groups like Islamic State do best. So I understand why there was such a desire, politically speaking, to get out of an area that seemed to yield such bitter fruits for us in terms of lost lives and spent treasure. But we really have to ask ourselves whether the Middle East as we find it today, with these metastasizing jihadi groups, isn't in fact significantly worse than the bad outcome that we had in 2009, which was a tough and brutal and in many ways mishandled war that nonetheless had yielded some kind of stability. Stability that, by the way, the Obama administration was busy touting and showing off about as late as 2012. One other just quick point related to what Jessica was saying. It behooves all of you, when you judge the Obama administration's foreign policy, to read the president's address at the National Defense University in May 2013, when he was basically saying, hey, we've won, and the future of terror lies in, kind of these minor, insignificant JV teams that are going to sort of be nuisance threats globally. This May 2013 was just barely two years ago. So it hurts America when the President of the United States makes these bold predictions about the future of terrorism, which are then sort of laughably upended by subsequent events.
What constructively do you, the Iraqis didn't want us there to stay. The Syrians, aside from very, very few, don't want us there. What constructively do you think the United States could and should do in Syria and Iraq that would actually make the situations better? Or will we just be running into fire for the hell of it?
Well, right now it's very difficult to see what we can do because essentially our inaction has created new realities that are very, very difficult to reverse. Once you've gone over the proverbial waterfall, it's hard to climb up. So we had options in Syria. Remember that the Syrian revolt there was no law of nature that said that Syria was going to descend into a kind of Hobbesian state of nature. There was actually a magnificent uprising against a terrible regime in 2011 that we could have nurtured and encouraged for a swift transition of power that might have then been followed by serious follow-up and serious diplomacy to create the kind of power-sharing structures between Alawites and Sunnis and so on that might have yielded results. Is there a guarantee? No, we can't say for sure. But those promises, what we might have done in 2011 is not what we can do today. I think today, at a minimum, what we should be thinking about seriously is establishing safe havens, no-fly zones, creating spaces in which Syrians don't have to flee their countries and end up on boats crossing the Mediterranean. I think that's a humanitarian imperative, but it's also a strategic imperative.
Tom, you have written about U.S.-China relations. What's your take on the administration's China policy and how it relates to previous administrations' China policy?
Well, I like the way you ask it, because by a very simple metric, you could be quite critical of the Obama administration's China policy. If you say, what was the state of U.S.-China relations in December 2008, January 2009 for the inauguration, U.S.-China relations were very good. And if you look at the region more generally, East Asia, the region was stable. The major powers in East Asia were all getting along with each other in a way that was not expected. And it wasn't accidental that those things were all happening. There were a good set of policies. There was a strong emphasis on alliances. There was, I think, a deft handling of what could have been a very tense situation across the Taiwan Strait. When you had a government in Taiwan that was pushing in the direction of independence from 2006 to 2008 especially. So I think it wasn't accidental that you had that. Now if you look at East Asia today, U.S.-China relations are much more tense than they were in January 2009, and the region is much less stable because of the various maritime disputes, disputes between Japan and China, disputes between the Southeast Asian countries and China. So if you use that metric, you'd say the Obama administration hasn't done a good job. What I try to do in the article is say that that's not a fair metric. Something happened to China in 2008 that changed the way China dealt with its neighbors and the United States, that made U.S.-China policy much more difficult for the Obama administration than arguably it was for the Bush administration. And that is, the financial crisis made China feel strong and almost cocky abroad because China had risen in power and the United States had declined quickly, at the same time that the Chinese government felt very afraid at home. And if you think of foreign policy like an academic, a 2x2 table, this is the worst sell for dealing with China in the 2x2 table. You have a China that's confident abroad and scared at home. That China is going to try to seize opportunities to pursue long-held claims in its region, and it's going to respond in a neuralgic, overly aggressive fashion to perceived challenges on its periphery. So I think the China that the Obama administration has dealt with is a much more difficult China to deal with. And I think that they've done a fairly good job. I mean, I can be critical of various things, and most of my criticisms have to do with rhetoric. I think there's been some domestically driven rhetoric that has been really counterproductive in the region, including the pivot to Asia, or the return to Asia, or the rebalance, which was, I believe, at the beginning, largely a product differentiation from the previous government, saying we're going to do things differently, but was unnecessary. And it wasn't inaccurate as well. The United States had never left Asia, and as I said before, the Bush administration's Asia policy record was quite strong. We were very present. There were lots of meetings. There were lots of people engaged. And I often joke that if we were absent in Asia, how do I explain to my wife where I was for 2 years working in the government? And if you look at the details of the pivot, the military details, these things take a long time. To change the military posture in Asia takes a long time. And those policies were in train before the Obama administration came in. F-22s to Japan, more submarines and ships to Guam, and on down the line. If you went into all the details, almost everything was in train before. So it was inaccurate as well. And what it did is it sparked Chinese nationalism, or it enhanced Chinese nationalism even more than it was, because it made it look like the United States was moving out of the Middle East and coming at China, which is not a helpful way to feed into Chinese domestic debates that we're trying to influence in a positive way. And ironically, I think in the long run, it wasn't reassuring to the neighbors. Of course, the neighbors of China were glad that the Americans were going to be paying lots of attention to East Asia, but the pivot idea made it seem like the United States has attention deficit disorder. It can only do one thing at once. Right? It's a great power, but it can only do one thing at once. And it's going to pivot away as soon as there's a problem in the Middle East. So I don't think it was particularly reassuring to use that kind of language of the pivot. And I think it caused a lot more trouble than it's worth. And there were other rhetorical problems that I saw in the, that I outline in the article as well. But what they did on the diplomatic front was quite significant. They did send more senior officials to East Asia. That wasn't fake. They had the Burma Initiative, which was quite positive. They joined the East Asia Summit, which I think is a good thing. And they made the East Asia Summit about something. It wasn't just a talk shop. They made it about the sovereignty disputes. They got ASEAN to think harder about the sovereignty disputes and about confidence building. So they did several things well. And when China did act in a rather cocky fashion in the region, they took the opportunity to strengthen the relationship with Japan, to encourage Japan to do more on the international stage, and to improve relations with allies like the Philippines for base access, and non-allies like Malaysia and Vietnam, all of which I think is good, and in the long run can make China rethink the benefits to China of using coercion or bullying tactics against the neighbors. So, on various policies, I give them a good score. On rhetoric, I think they did more trouble. They caused more trouble than it was worth.
I spend a lot of my time these days poo-pooing various threats or crises that I think people are overly head up about because they're not that important or they're not that strategically significant or they're not going to blow up soon. The one that really does strike me as having the truly great, significant potential for catastrophic harm is sort of a U.S.-China conflict and the kind of bumping up against each other that's happening in the South China Sea. And these island building things scare the crap out of me because it's the kind of thing that you could actually see ultimately possibly escalating. Does that worry you? And in general, do you think it's possible for the U.S. and China to avoid an escalatory spiral?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's probable.
That they will avoid it.
That we will avoid it. I'm not saying, I'm not making predictions. I do think it's difficult, and I think that the challenges that the Obama administration faces, and the Bush administration as well, and the next administration will face, is that you have claims in that region that go very far back in history. And the unfortunate thing from this is the political scientist in me, the unfortunate thing is my strong belief from talking to people who are involved in the various countries that are making the claims, is that they all really believe their claims are legitimate. I think the Chinese really believe the 9-dash line is legitimate. It goes back to the nationalist government, the KMT. I believe the Vietnamese believe their claims are legitimate and that they weren't there when that 9-dash line was drawn. They were a colony and they didn't have a say. I believe the Philippines has the same view. And the problem there is when everybody believes they're defending the legitimate status quo, we know from human psychology, from Tversky and Kahneman's work, the Nobel Prize-winning work, that people take bigger risks and pay bigger costs to defend those things. And one of those claimants, the Philippines, is an ally. So it is dangerous. I think that the island building was surprisingly assertive for China. I think it's somewhat blown out of proportion by people who see it as a great military threat to the United States. I don't think that's how it plays out. You wouldn't want to be on one of those man-made islands if you're at war with the United States. It would be a very bad place to be. But they are challenges to the other claimants. And I think the appropriate response is to make sure China understands that those man-made islands project no territorial sea, no EEZ, and don't interfere in any way with U.S. military freedom of navigation. That's what the freedom of navigation issue in
So would you actually send, let's say, ships through that area deliberately to reinforce it? Yes.
Yes.
And that wouldn't be seen as provocative by the Chinese?
It might be seen as provocative, but better that they understand the meaning of those sand piles now than later.
Good. Okay.
So I would certainly do that. And I would also provide the wherewithal to China's neighbors so that they can have asymmetric approaches to China's superior power in the same way that China is developing asymmetric approaches to American superior power. There's no reason why those tactics can't be used by China's neighbors. And I think to some degree that's starting to happen. We're trying to sell more things to the Philippines. Japan is selling things to the Philippines. And I think Vietnam should be able to develop some of these capabilities as well. They have a very long coast, and it shouldn't be free for any country to bully them on their claims. And the U.S. takes no position on the claims. The whole goal is to prevent someone from trying to coerce all of the neighbors and use military force to settle those claims.
It's funny hearing you talk about the claims. It reminds me of the Middle East. When I taught the Israel-Palestine conflict, I used to say that to understand this, you should watch the producers. Because, you know, when you have lots of multiple claims, the whole plot of the producers, of course, was that lots of producers were there. It was going to be a big failure. Everyone would lose their money and you'd pocket all the multiple claims. But when it was a big success, everyone started to fight over the claims, and that's what brought the whole thing down. Moving to so it's interesting. Middle East. Walter, you're writing a book on Israel. What the hell should the United States do about Israel and the new Middle East, and what's going on now?
That's an interesting question. One of the things that I've found from my research, such as it is that the United States does not actually matter as much to Israel as we sometimes think it does. And American Jews don't matter as much to American policy over Israel as some American Jews and some non-Jews think. I found it actually very interesting to go back to the Truman administration, the period when Israel became independent, and you can read lots of books on this era that basically focus on Jews lobbying Truman on bits of policy over Palestine, like this is the story. And then, you know, the climax, Eddie Jacobson, like Queen Esther in the Bible, who comes out to Truman and says, "You've got to see Chaim Weizmann." And Truman agrees, and he sees Weizmann, and Israel is saved. I mean, this is the sort of narrative that both sort of pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist writers agree with. You really look at what happened there. Here's the facts. By 1945, the Jews of the Yeshuv, the organization in what's now Israel, knew they would win a war with the Palestinian Arabs, a civil war. They were pretty confident they could win that. They didn't see how they could beat the British in a direct war. The British were then occupying it, and they certainly didn't see how they could manage to win a war against 5 Arab armies that might invade, who would also be, in fact, aided by the British. You go through all this and you see what happens is the British believed that holding on to Palestine was the key to Britain's survival as a global power. That the oil from the Middle East in the Sterling Zone would give Britain the economic basis. And so they were willing to fight wars in Greece to protect the Middle East. They were very active and they were opposed to immigration. In 1947, the British economy collapsed in January. Terrible winter, Labour government, there was no coal, there was no heat, they had to reintroduce lobbying, and the British within about 3 weeks said, we're getting out of Palestine, we're getting out of India. They basically, they just in January, February, early March of 1947, the British throw in the towel, and they announce they're going to give up the UN mandate. So at this point, the problem for the Palestinian Jews is, okay, we'll beat the Palestinian Arabs probably. What do we do about the other Arabs? They counted up. They had 10,000 rifles. It's not enough. The U.S. puts an arms embargo on Israel, on the area. We're not going to sell them arms. Stalin sells them arms. The Czechoslovakia sells them arms. This enables them to have the confidence to declare independence. You can tell the story of Israel becoming independent without mentioning the word Harry Truman, or even without mentioning the word United States. We did have a role, but not nearly as big as...
And is that going to be true for the future as well?
Well, I think what's happened, and I think this happened to President Obama, but he's certainly not the only one, American presidents have often have the belief that we have more leverage over Israel than we do. And you can look, you see over and over and over again small powers who believe they have existential stakes in some question can face down great power patrons. Israel is not dependent on American military assistance in the sense that it won its first war with Soviet weapons. It won the 1956 war with French weapons. It won the 67 war with French weapons. U.S. weapons only came in with 73. Israel has changed great power partners in the past. It's clear today that India, Russia, a number of other countries would value Israel, high tech, the amount of American secret information they have. There are a lot of assets that Israel puts on the table, particularly in some ways for India, where it is the largest supplier of arms to India today. And there's a natural complementarity between the economies. So in fact, U.S. leverage over Israel.
Look for this as an article in a future Foreign Affairs, by the way. I like this. We'll talk
Okay.
about this.
Israel has, U.S. has less leverage. The first thing we should do is be more realistic about what we can do and stop, in a sense, trying to take responsibility for a situation that we really don't control and never have control.
Okay, specific implication about the peace process?
Well, again, I think the biggest mistake, and there's a long list of mistakes Americans have made in this peace process. The biggest one was probably when Bill Clinton bet the farm on getting a deal before he left the office. We had a peace process in the 1990s. It had problems, but it was making some progress, and it was a venue in which things could be discussed. The peace process is basically blown up in 2000 in the last few weeks of the Clinton administration, 2000, 2001. And since then, we have not been able to recover that. A peace process would be a great thing. To do that, we have to have a clearer understanding of the real bottom lines of both parties, because if we want peace more than the parties want peace, right, we're not going to get it. We also, I think, we need to, this is something I actually did write in Foreign Affairs when Obama first came in, that we need to think a lot more about the Palestinians in the sense that the two-state solution doesn't solve enough problems for enough Palestinians for Israelis to believe in it. That is, there'll be too many Palestinians still stuck in Gaza, still stuck in Syria, which is not a great place to be stuck in, let me tell you, these days, or Lebanon, or other places. And there will still be a national movement of resistance among the Palestinians, even with the two-state deal, that will get lots of support from various regional powers who enjoy sort of meddling and magnifying their influence. So I think even today, even with the polarization in Israel, you would get a majority for a two-state solution if the Israelis believed that it would stick. And they don't, and the reason is it's rational, and it actually is not far from dehumanizing the Palestinians. It's somewhat humanizing in the sense it says it's not a good enough deal for them. Now, what has to happen if we're serious about peace is that we've got to, the rest of the world has to put more on the table, frankly, for the Palestinians. There's only so much land. If Israel went back absolutely to the 67 borders, it's not enough land to solve the problems of the Palestinians. So we need to be thinking, what else is there? Is it integration into different Western and other societies? Is it a large package of financial compensation? What is the mix of things that needs to happen to make the end of this conflict seem like a good thing to a Palestinian family sitting in Gaza who, if there is a two-state solution, might be stuck in a refugee hut in Gaza forever? Why is that an advantage? So we have to think much more deeply about this. Again, there's a certain sense that those of us not directly engaged in the conflict, Europeans, Americans, others, we tend to look both at the Israelis and the Palestinians like irrational children squabbling in a sandbox, while we are the mature, responsible adults. I don't care who started it, I just want you both to stop it now. This sort of approach. And that is our position. But it's also, really in the United States.
I can testify that accurately represents the attitudes of a number of U.S. government officials.
Yes, exactly. We just want you to stop.
I have heard it said that there are some conflicts in the world that are better understood through child psychology than international relations theory.
But here's the reality. Why is there such a Palestinian refugee crisis? Why did it happen? Well, it's when the British gave up their mandate back in 1948.
You can't go backwards now. We don't have enough time to go back to the mandate period.
It's just a very quick thing here, that the UN did not then put in another authority. And so you sort of these two states, that the UN was legally responsible for the security of both peoples. The UN steps back, a war happens. Whoever won, there was going to be a big refugee problem and a catastrophe. So by trying to act as if we aren't co-responsible in some ways and don't have an obligation to help make this thing work, I think we're just in we put ourselves in a false position in our negotiations and our intervention. That's one reason. I mean, how much negotiating effort has the United States put into this? Probably roughly equal to all the negotiating energy we put into everything else in the last 70 years, and we don't have a lot to show for it. Maybe it's time to rethink some of the assumptions behind what we're doing.
The former editor of the Jerusalem Post is demanding a quick two-finger, after which we'll go to questions.
Well, no, just very briefly, and it has nothing to do with that. I think this is what Walter has been talking about is an excellent reason why you need to broaden your reading list beyond political science journals and even Foreign Affairs magazine, because
the horror.
People's philosophical concepts, their ideas of honor and dishonor, of virtue and vice, are not what probably those of us on this panel think they may be. And so when you say, well, let's take a case, Iran. Well, what Iran wants is, more spare parts for their Boeing planes, or materialistic goods. That may not be, in fact, what the Iranian regime is all about, what animates their policies. What animates their policies are a set of philosophical ideas which go far beyond that. And so it's important, political philosophy helps you understand that these concepts of Western liberalism that we take as kind of universal truths and givens are actually dramatically in dispute. I mean, we may say ISIS is horrible, but they believe they're following a kind of a concept of a just society and a virtuous society against the decadence that they see in Arab regimes or in the West. And it's also a reason to read literature. I mean, I had a wonderful time reading Andrew Roberts' history or biography of Napoleon. And there's a wonderful line I was reading about his time on St. Helena at the end of his life, and Napoleon makes some comment. He says something like, "What a novel my life has been," And Napoleon was in fact a kind of a novelist manqué. He wrote terrible fiction, so he decided to conquer Europe instead. This is what happens to stunted writers. So think of what exactly is animating Vladimir Putin? Is it that the ruble is falling? Is it a concept of Russian national interest, or is he saying, what's the most interesting thing I could do next so that my biography will be really rip-roaringly great and a guy like Andrew Roberts will want to write it? I mean, I'm just saying, broaden your horizons a little beyond the typical parameters of political science or IR discourse.
So after grad school, you'll be able to analyze with the levels of analysis Bret's various theories, which may work a little better in the small group units that Jessica studies with sacred nut terrorists than it does with states overall who may work. She doesn't use the term sacred nuts. That was
I like
fine.
that one.
But we have time. We could talk about all these subjects all evening, of course, with all these great raconteurs and experts. But let's just get a few questions in so that I don't get yelled at too much afterwards. So yes, over here. Hold on one second. Stand, state your name, and we'll get a microphone to you. I should say that all this is actually on the record too, apparently.
Excellent. My name is Elvis Diaz, Columbia University. If the Iran deal turns out, if it happens, would that be Obama's greatest foreign policy achievement?
Will it be?
Will it be? Yes.
If the Iran deal goes through, which it now looks like it will it be one of the great achievements? I'll take that and say I think it'll be one of it. I think it's overblown. I think it's a good, solid deal that helps solve temporarily a limited piece of a larger problem, and so I think it's worth doing, and I would support it. I think it's gotten hugely controversial here more because of domestic politics than because of the actual side of the deal. But I think it'll be seen in history as a good, solid thing like a lot of other arms control agreements. Walter and I know certainly Bret will go in an opposite way.
No. I'm actually going to say that I think that probably when future historians look back on the Obama administration, they may say the most significant development from the standpoint of American power was fracking. In the sense that it was in the last 8 years that there's been a transformation of America's energy posture in ways that are going to be extremely significant. And that historically has been the case, that very often the controversies that get so, the specific issues that everybody thinks about in the time, was it Petticaris alive or somebody dead?
Petticaris alive, Razzulli.
Razzulli.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. Who remembers that?
We all do.
I don't remember it very well, but all right, these guys.
It was Libyan terrorism.
Right. So anyway.
That was one of our major encounters with Libyan terrorism. Tripoli.
Was that one in Tripoli or
Actually,
was
it
that
was
one
in
in
Morocco.
Morocco?
Morocco?
What?
It was in Morocco.
Morocco.
The Barbary pirates. I'm confusing them all.
But
this is
in
why you
any
study
case,
history.
the point is
Morocco,
that,
that's right.
that the noise in the
We
newspapers
wrote about this.
is often only very distantly related to the real march of events. And it's the dynamism. This is probably a point that all of us on the panel might well agree with. It's the dynamism of American society that is the key driver of America's global position and power. And the interesting thing about that is in the last 8 years, there's been a revolution in the American energy outlook.
Absolutely. Great. Do you want to jump in on the Iran deal?
No, I mean, I agree, and I actually think one of the strange points of agreement between Gideon and me is we're actually very optimistic about the United States, because I sometimes notice at the Journal we get all sorts of visitors and visitors from countries like Colombia or Rwanda not too long ago we met with the president of Colombia, a really impressive guy, and I was thinking, it's when you're running a country like Colombia, you've got to be a really good leader, because the problems this country has are so severe that the president matters. Whereas in America, we can have terrible presidents, whether you think it was George W. Bush or Barack Obama, and the country miraculously does quite well, because there is a resilience in the United States, an inventiveness, the fact that great things come from unexpected places, the fact that people who've had careers as unusual as ours, and I'm sure yours, end up sort of rising in odd ways. That is a source of strength that, in a sense, makes a nonsense of many of our bad political and policy choices. Just briefly to your question, I think the Iran deal is going to be a landmark Obama event. Whether it's an achievement, we're going to find out in about 15 years, because whatever Obama says about this, I don't think this is a transactional deal just about their nuclear deal. This is a bet on Iran's future. Is this deal going to accelerate the liberalizing forces inside of Iran and give us breathing room so that those liberal forces that were brutally repressed in 2009 can come back to life? Or, on the contrary, is it going to empower the regime regionally in a nuclear way with prestige and give the regime and its worst elements more life? And I guess we'll find out in 15 years.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, on this, I said before, bad, terrible, and worse. Unless someone convinces me otherwise, this looks like bad, right?
Meaning that it's the least bad.
Yeah. It looks like a bad deal that's better than the status quo, which was, having worked in the government and worked and tried to convince the Chinese to put pressure on Iran, along with a lot of other people. I think the status quo was very, very bad, right? I think Iran was going in a very bad direction. And I think that unless someone can convince me otherwise, I'm not impressed by the Iranian regime is bad, therefore you shouldn't cut a deal with it arguments that you often see in 30-second TV.
You wouldn't be, because you've been cutting deals with bad regimes your entire career.
But here's where I worry, and I don't think we're going to know whether the Iran deal is a success or not for quite a long time, because we don't know about compliance. And the part that makes me nervous about the deal is the degree of confidence that's expressed about what's called snapback. And if you know anything about the history of the sanctions regime on Iran, it came about in fits and starts, and most of it wasn't done at the UN Security Council. Most of it was done over the objections of the administration and Congress. And those sanctions started to bite not just Iran, they started to bite Iran's partners. So I studied China. So Chinese energy firms started to get worried because they saw the fracking revolution and they wanted to get in the American energy markets, and they realized that they could become targeted by sanctions. So they started to cut back on their energy purchases. And who's the big economic partner of Iran? Not the United States, not the Europeans, it's China. China is the only member of the P5+1 process that is both a net importer of energy and willing to live with an Iran that is on the periphery of international society because of its nuclear program. So when Iran cheats on the deal, right, and you have to assume there's going to be some degree of cheating, right? When Iran cheats on the deal, how do you get that snapback back into place? When China always objected to the unilateral measures of the European Parliament and the US Congress in laying these sanctions that affected their firms. Are they going to just snap back with us? If they don't, how do you do it? And my broader philosophical point is the way the world is interdependent today, there aren't America-only solutions to most problems. You're going to have a multilateral coalition of allies and non-allies like China, and China's economy is so big that if China decides to have normal relations with a targeted regime, that regime can survive all the pressure that the United States and the Europeans can level on it. So this is, I think, the real challenge of China's rise for the United States, and I emphasize this in my book, is that we've never had such a powerful developing country in the past. And what China decides is going to be very consequential for solving all of these global problems, non-proliferation, climate change, financial stability. But we're asking people who are making in 2012 $9,000 a year on average to contribute greatly to global stability. We've never done that before. And in 2012, China had the same per capita GNP as Ecuador. And no one's asking Ecuadorians to contribute lots of money to global governance and lots of efforts and lots of diplomatic chips to global governance. It's not true for China because there are 1.3 billion Chinese, and the world is so interdependent now that we can't afford to get these things done. So snapback, maybe, but you have to convince the Chinese that the violation is clear enough, the violation is serious enough, that they're going to snap back to where they were under a sanctions regime that they never agreed with. So that's going to be difficult.
I would disagree with your comment on the sense that if you take all the graduate students at American universities, I would say the average is maybe around $9,000 a year, and we're asking them to deal with the future global problems of the world. And on that note, we're going to segue to the next phase of tonight's event. Thank you all for coming. Thank all of you panelists. To be continued. We got in the back.